People are living longer, and that's a good thing. But how those extra years may affect your family, your finances, or your well-being, that's a little more complicated. One big factor is health. Take, for example, dementia.
Once you're 85, you have about a 1 in 4 chance of having dementia.
That's our guest today, Dr. Zahinoor Ismail. He's a dementia expert and clinician scientist at the Hotchkiss Brain Institute at the University of Calgary. It's estimated that 650,000 caregivers will be called on to support people with dementia alone by 2050 in Canada. And the cost of caregiving is something many Canadians don't plan for.
That fear of how are we going to pay for this is really distressing.
That's why Scotia Wealth Management supports a charity called Gordie Howe CARES. They provide support and education for caregivers of people living with Alzheimer's and dementia-related diseases. They also fund dementia research, like the work being done by Dr. Ismail at the University of Calgary. He's our guest this episode to tell us all about the often overlooked emotional and financial impacts of caring for those with dementia, a job that usually falls upon family and friends. It's an important conversation you won't want to miss. I'm Stephen Maurice, and this is Perspectives. Dr. Ismail, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk quite a bit today about caregiving and caregivers when it comes to dementia, but maybe we can just sort of set the stage and you can talk just about dementia and Alzheimer's. We certainly hear a lot more about it all the time these days. Everybody seems to be impacted in some ways. Can you just give us sort of the lay of the land when it comes to dementia?
A good place to start is even just defining dementia and distinguishing it from Alzheimer's. So dementia is a clinical syndrome. And by clinical syndrome, we mean, a collection of symptoms. And it's characterized usually by the insidious onset of changes in cognitive status, memory, thinking, attention, planning, organizing, sequencing. And after that insidious onset, there's a gradual progression to the extent that independent living is compromised. So the threshold between, say, mild cognitive impairment and dementia is that measure of functional independence.
Okay.
So dementia and the cognitive continuum there define a syndrome, but under the hood are the different diseases that cause that dementia syndrome. And by far and away, the most common disease causing dementia is Alzheimer's disease, followed by cerebrovascular changes. So, the same kind of risk factors that contribute to stroke risk, for example, also would contribute to dementia risk. That often will occur in conjunction with Alzheimer's disease. But again, Alzheimer's disease is the cause for the vast majority of dementias. So first and foremost, the biggest risk factor for developing Alzheimer's disease is age. So the older you get, the more likely you are to have it. In Canada, as per the Canadian Study of Health and Aging, once you're 85, you have about a 1 in 4 chance of having dementia.
Wow. Okay, so maybe we'll switch over to that whole caregiver question. And maybe you could even just describe what we mean when we talk about caregivers. Because I think, we would have thought in the past it would be professionals like you and the nurses and the medical staff who would be providing actual care. But I think the definition is way more expansive than that now.
The definition of caregiver has evolved, and there are different terminologies. So I tend to use caregiver as a broad umbrella term, and then we can divide it up based on whether they are friend or family, unpaid people participating in the care. I call those family friend care partners, or paid formal caregivers whose vocation or job it is to take care. I call those paid care providers. So family friend care partners and paid care providers. The former, again, mostly it's family, and whether this is a spouse or a child or some combination thereof just varies. We sometimes see people who don't have close family, and it's a friend who's stepped up and ended up participating in their care. When it comes to paid care providers, this stems across the spectrum. If persons with dementia are under-resourced with external supports, then more of that burden falls on the family friend care provider, which is an incredibly stressful time for myriad reasons. And the more that falls on them, the greater their stress and the more likely they are to take someone to the emergency room, to the hospital, or then require long-term care. And if people want to age in place, then it's essential that not only are sufficient resources provided to the patient and their family friend care partners, but also system-wide to resource those external supports that help the care partner. So it's a system that requires support from all ends, but overall to ensure safety and a good quality of life for the person with dementia and the people who care for them.
So what guidance do you provide or support do you provide to, and I would speak specifically more to the non-professionals, to the families and friends and so on. How do you help them to deal with this really very difficult situation?
So I divide this into three categories, and families need to figure out to what extent each of these contribute to their overall burden. So one is features relating to the person with dementia. Specifically, is it changes in cognition, changes in behavior, or changes in function? And then even in more detail, changes in cognition can entail being forgetful and having to be told things over and over again, or saying things over and over again. Or it can be changes in attention, or it can be in executive functioning, which is like planning, organizing, sequencing, abstraction, or changes in language and communication. Changes in each of those cognitive domains affect different family units differently, depending on what they're used to or what they need. In terms of changes in behavior, I break that down into 5 parts. Is it apathy? Sometimes people have diminished interest, initiative, and emotional reactivity. And that's really hard on family members because their loved one is passive. They can't even get them out the door to go to the dentist. Or is it mood and anxiety symptoms, which are probably the most common, and those certainly can affect the stress in that relationship. We see agitation, and agitation can present as verbal aggression, physical aggression, or revved up excessive motor activity type of syndrome. We can see people who are socially disinhibited and they kind of lose their social mores, their tact, their empathy, and that can be problematic. Or we can see where people's eyes and ears play tricks on them and they can see things that other people don't see or hear things that other people don't hear, or they can become suspicious of someone stealing from them. And delusions of theft are the most common type of delusion in Alzheimer's disease. Then there are the functional changes. So is it what we call basic activities of daily living? This is the bathing, taking your meds, hygiene, grooming, choosing your clothes, toileting, feeding, or earlier on, instrumental activities of daily living. So this is like going shopping and cooking, maintaining your home, paying your bills and your taxes, getting from A to B, etc. And as dementia progresses, as the underlying disease progresses, more and more of these functions are impaired. And depending on what someone's used to, for example, I've seen many patients over the years where the person with dementia really managed the household finances. When they became incapable, it was thrust onto a person who just had never really done it. And that's extremely hard. Whereas if, say, a child is an accountant, and it's easy for them to take over their mom and dad's finances. So again, all of these are individual factors. Then there are factors related to the caregiver themselves. Are they prepared? Do they have knowledge? Do they understand the disease? Do they have education? Do they know what to expect? Do they feel like it's fair? Do they feel like it's under their control? Do they feel obligated to be the caregiver because of gender or cultural expectations? Do they wonder, why me? Do they have their own children to take care of? At the same time, sandwiched between that and the growing needs of their parents. So there are all those kind of internal factors, right? Do they feel like they're missing out? Is there more conflict at home? Do they not get promoted at work because there were too many doctor's appointments? These types of things. And then there are the external stressors. So the third domain is, okay, what kind of support do you have? One of the bigger predictors of stress is whether there is availability for someone to come in and help them, or for them to go somewhere and be helped. in the accessibility and the appropriateness of these resources. So if someone needs toileting or bathing and they're left with a frail spouse who can't lift them, that's a problem, right? So that is an essential external resource that's required. And again, these are all different for every kind of family unit, every person with dementia.
And is there some common thread? Is there a thing that you hear about most from those families or friends who are giving the care that is the most difficult? I mean, I would think that the emotional aspects of it would be among the most challenging. And certainly I have some experience of all of this. Everything you've talked about is very familiar to me. The emotional difficulties are very real. Is that sort of what you hear about most? Or is it, especially if you need care, like the financial aspects of it are not nothing either?
Certainly the access to care and external supports, that can be a financial issue. When it's there, it's a great stress. And the emotional symptoms certainly are, I think, probably on average at the top of the list. But again, this really varies. And I mentioned apathy. Surprisingly, our preliminary data really show that that is a great contributor to stress. And I expected it to be, say, agitation or psychotic symptoms. Apathy seems to be a big one. But we are studying this, and this is where Gordie Howe CARES comes in as well. In addition to addressing a lot of these issues, especially around providing education and illness awareness, and with the Ripples website and the support available through that, there's something for caregivers to go to specifically designed for them. But Gordie Howe CARES has also funded our nationwide caregiver study, and it's called Can Protect. Now, when you want to study and understand the limitations and risks and the stressors in caregivers, the last thing you want to do is say, okay, how would you like to be in a study? You got to come to the university clinic and give us 4 hours of your time next Wednesday at 9 a.m. That's not a strategy for success. It's great demands on caregivers' time. So we developed a 100% online study available to anyone to do on their own time. And it's called Can Protect. And then the website is www.can-protect.ca. Gordie Howe CARES helped fund the development and the building of this study, which launched a year ago. We already have 2,800 people coast to coast to coast. Every province and territory are represented. So it's an online study of risk and resilience in brain aging. So actually any Canadian resident 18 or over can participate. And there's a series of assessments that are then completed annually. And we're looking at trajectories, how people do, do they decline, do they improve, do they stay stable? And we try to determine what are the factors contributing to overall outcomes. In this study, caregivers are participants. So there are specific caregiver questionnaires that I developed to address in detail those domains that we discussed. One set is for the family, friend, care partners, but I also developed a brand new scale that really didn't exist anywhere for the paid care providers, because understanding their risk is also important for recruitment and retention into the field. To ensure people want to work and care for persons with dementia, we need to know how to make it. And again, that feeds into the whole system. But ultimately, keeping someone at home and out of hospital or emergency room or long-term care is a very important issue for which we need more data. So understanding that caregiver stress as it relates to the person with dementia, and then how that stress affects the caregiver themselves as we observe them annually and see how they're doing. And we can do all sorts of interesting analyses in this regard. But again, our preliminary data tell us that a lack of external supports, a lack of education about dementia, and then those emotional factors especially, but any of that list of stressors, depending on context, can contribute to someone's stress, and including the financials.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about what do you hear on the financial side?
I mean, I hear this frequently. Just this week, I had a remarkable caregiver. She's one of the most resilient I've seen in my 25 years of practice, and she's providing support extensively and determined to keep her husband at home. But also, there's no chance that she can afford the copay and the expenses of putting someone in long-term care. And it's a really underlying stressor, despite her remarkable resilience, where she can deal with the agitation. She can deal with the fact that her husband just can't communicate anymore, and that he has these interactive discussions with himself in the mirror at night that she's got to pull him away from and get him to bed. All of that she can cope with, but that fear of what happens when I can't, how are we going to pay for this, is really distressing to her.
Yeah, I can imagine. And does the taboo still sort of exist around dementia or cognitive decline? Is that another thing that affects caregivers? And by that, I mean the families and friends more than the professionals.
Overall, I see this improving. However, there are cultural differences. Some cultures, there's no chance that person's going anywhere but home, period. Right. Come hell or high water. And so you have to work with that in mind and do your absolute level best to give them the resources they need, because the stigma and the shame around not being able to keep someone at home for them is huge, irrespective of what the reality is. These are their values. This is what you work with.
So why do you do this? What drew you to this particular field of study with all of its challenges and its heartaches, really? I mean, it's very difficult to watch someone go through that kind of decline, and you would see it over and over again. What drew you to this?
Two things. First, I always thought the brain was the coolest organ. To me, understanding the brain was always just of great interest, but mostly I had a close relationship with my grandmother. And when you look at data to determine what factors help physicians choose their specialty for people who go into the care of the elderly, neurology, geriatric psychiatry, et cetera, strong role models, and close relationships with elderly people early on was a really big part of it. And so fostering that moving forward is something really important. You see some daycares are linked with seniors' homes, and having that normalization of aging and elderly helps people appreciate seniors more. And there's a cultural, I'm a South Asian background, like we revere our elderly. So there's that, predisposition as well. So it's a number of factors, but most importantly is that we're all humans and we look at each other with compassion. And yeah, it's hard sometimes working with complicated patients and the lack of resources and the stress and the multiple systems that are affected in terms of their health. But on the other hand, it can be remarkably rewarding, and people have lived a whole lifetime. They deserve our care.
And do you get the sense from caregivers, again, like family, friends, that they can take something rewarding out of that difficult experience?
You see over the course of someone's disease that people's lives are changed. Their outlook has changed. And I do often see a healthy growth and acceptance, a knowledge of self and their loved one come through this. I do see that less when there's a profound amount of stress on them, because then they can't see through that and look at the condition, in a more holistic sense or dispassionately, because it's just so scary and terrifying. Education is such a big part of this. One is much less afraid of what they know versus what they don't know. And we don't provide enough of that. Again, that's why I really like Ripples as a website for caregivers to get information and support. And that's why we need studies like Can Protect to get a representative sample across the country of diverse peoples geographically, different ethnocultural backgrounds, to understand the specific contributors to this whole experience, to caregiver stress, to aging, to risk resilience. And so more research is required, and more partners like Gordie Howe CARES are essential.
Dr. Ismail, thank you so much. It's been a fascinating conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I've been speaking with Dr. Zahinoor Ismail, Clinician Scientist at the Hotchkiss Brain Institute at the University of Calgary. The Perspectives podcast is made by me, Stephen Maurice, as well as Armina Lagaya and our producer, Andrew Norton. For a transcript of this episode, as well as other stories, insights, analysis, and thought leadership, visit our website, scotiabank.com/perspectives. We'll see you next time.